Hi there, my name is Rich Prashad, and today I'm going to talk about onboarding excellence and how you can reduce time to value for onboarding your B2B SaaS customers. So we'll start a little bit with the problem, and that would be slow time to value, slow TTV, which is one of the most common challenges in software as a service products. So before we talk about the challenge itself, we want to talk a little bit about the impact of not solving it. So that includes low customer ROI, that includes higher cost of delivering your services, which eats into your gross margins, and most importantly, friction in your key renewal conversations. So the answer for solving this is to really prioritize a strategic focus on your onboarding excellence capabilities. And before we go into exactly how to do that, let's first understand how we'll measure the current state and the desired state. So as a reminder, we have our beloved go-to-market velocity formula, which is a measure of how fast you're able to land customers, deliver impact, and expand customer value. However, when we're talking about onboarding excellence, we're really talking about the measures of the success rate percentage and the success cycle length. So I'll link into the description of the video, a link to the go-to-market velocity formula, so you can learn a little bit more about calculating success rate percentage and the success cycle length, so that becomes very clear. So now I'll move on to onboarding excellence and framing both the problem and the potential solutions. So the problem and a typical scenario we see in B2B SaaS is an example that looks like this. We have an average customer onboarding time of 3 months, and our customers are unhappy with the time and effort it takes for them to get the promised value from my product. There's a mix of delays of both internal and external challenges. And for the sake of the conversation, let's imagine that 30% of those delays are internally driven and 70% of the delays are externally driven. And so we need to fix challenges such as a lack of rigor in onboarding project management. We need to improve our process for reporting our onboarding progress and risk to customers to drive urgency and accountability both internally and externally. We need to control our controllables wherever possible. So we really need to look at the process itself and eliminate any delays. Next, we also want to evaluate where in our product there's an opportunity for us to reduce the effort through user experience improvements or training improvements in order to reduce the time to onboard. And we want to also look at our contracting process to ensure that we have all the levers we need contractually so that if we want to exercise them, we can minimize the costs on our side due to customer delays. So how can we make sure that if customers are outside of the scope of their agreement, that we have a mechanism in our contracts for handling those? And our desired state. So in this example, we'd like to go from that 3 months to less than a month and be on budget for the time that we think that it takes to onboard new customers. So that's a little bit about the framing of the problem, and we'll come back to that later. So on the solution side, we already said that 70% of the delays are external and 30% of the delays are internal. So we'll focus on each of those individually. So on the external side, we really break these 3 delays into the following categories. We have a lack of customer preparation, we have a suboptimal onboarding process, and we lack rigor in our project financials management. So we'll focus on the first one to start. So lack of customer preparation is a common challenge in onboarding excellence. And so the problem can typically be framed as customers really are not prepared to provide what's needed from them in order for us to execute the best product configurations for their needs. And so when we break this down, what we really need from customers is quite simple. We need them to make decisions, or we need them to provide high quality data, either for integrations into those source systems or for us to bulk import that data into our product so our product can become the system of record. And so what really happens during this time is that customers are really afraid of two things in making those decisions, and they need a lot of help in making the right decision. So they're either afraid of messing up the onboarding and losing out on value, and afraid of missing out on potential value if they don't leverage that onboarding period effectively. So we want to come up with solutions that really solve for these fears and make sure that they feel like they are not missing out on anything. So there's multiple components to the solution around customer preparedness, and we'll go through that a little bit now. So first, we have the ability for us to accelerate the decision-making process. And so this is done in a few ways. We can make the decision for the customer. And so I see this as like something that isn't done enough. We typically have in our head and in our experiences a lot of areas in our onboarding where rather than asking the customer to make a decision, we can make smart default assumptions. And then later on, if those defaults become wrong, they will be pretty apparent and we can come back and we can modify them. But making those default assumptions really lower the cognitive load for the customer, as well as speed up the onboarding time. And we can focus customers on key decisions that really do require them to think through the options and where there are good trade-offs. The next thing we want to do is to invest in content that guides the decision-making process. So how can, again, rather than telling the customer about the decision that they're making and the impact, how can we show them? So we can either have that line of questioning in presentations, in documentation. We can show them that in the product in terms of this is what option A will look like in the product. This is what option B will look like in the product. And here's a slide that helps you to evaluate the pros and the cons of doing that. So really investing in content to make it a very options-based or consultative or prescriptive decision-making process can go a long way in speeding up your onboarding. The next is taking more of a consultative approach to the overall onboarding decision-making process. And so this is where you can leverage your years of experience in the customer's domain to, based on what you've learned about them so far, really take the approach of prescribing what it is that they should be doing based on the best practice. And you'd be surprised how many customers really do want to be driven towards those best practices. Sure, they'll make some tweaks around the edges, but they definitely want to be presented with the best practice option. And so this is where investing in solution consultants, really investing in their professional development to become experts in your product domain can add a ton of value and really lower the amount of effort that it takes for customers to make good decisions. I suggest you also make this content available during the sales process so that customers can work ahead of the contract being signed. So you'll notice that the next theme is doing work in parallel. So how do we not create false dependencies on executing the work until every decision and piece of data is ready? And so one of those areas is how do we give customers content and access to where they can do homework on their own time while the deal is still underway, so that when the deal is signed, they're ready to hit the ground running, and you've taken advantage of working in parallel. And so not working in parallel is a common mistake that I see where you really have an opportunity to execute on smaller units of work based on what's been provided so far. And so rather than taking a very waterfall approach, you can really break those deliverables into smaller units of value and work through them much more quickly based on what the customer is able to decide on. And so the risk here is often rework, and you can really avoid that rework by organizing the decisions into compartmentalized modules and features. And so when you compartmentalize it, then there's not going to be as much impact into other areas of the system where you are making like fundamental decisions. Of course, you want to make sure that customers understand that there might be rework when those fundamental decisions are made. But for most of the decisions, you can really break them into compartmentalized modules and features where If that decision is changed later on, there's not going to be really a lot of rework outside of changing that modular feature component itself. When you come across large amounts of rework, this is also your trigger to go back to where your onboarding methodology has failed. So this is where either we can make better default assumptions and we can make better out-of-the-box recommendations. We can improve our content to flag those risks of wrong decisions to our customers, and we can improve our consulting methodology in order to make it so that we can catch those watchouts earlier. We can work with customers to understand the key decisions so that they take a little bit more time to make those decisions if it's going to risk a large amount of rework. The next way that we can really help customers to make better decisions and to provide high quality data is helping them to prioritize their work. So this is really helping them to understand which decisions and data are required for which modules and features. Customers have a hard time in being able to organize all that's being asked of them sometimes, and this will help them to focus on what's easy for them to provide, what are the things that they already know versus decisions that require internal collaboration in order to decide the best way forward. And so the other thing to do is help them to decide which decisions are required versus which decisions are optimal. So separating must-haves from nice-to-haves and things that can be delivered later on once they have gotten that immediate time to value or that immediate value from the module. They can always come back and add bells and whistles later on. The last area is really to think about providing options to do the work on behalf of the customer. So this is where you can build out professional services packages where the customer lacks the skills or resources to do some of the work themselves. Let's say it's like data prep on their side. Let's say it's additional project management work. Let's say it's additional training work. This is where you can start to think about professional services packages, especially for enterprise customers. You can also look at whether you should consider subcontracting this work to system integrators if that's not a capability you want to build out in-house into your SaaS company. So moving on from lack of customer preparation, we'll look at the onboarding process itself as a way of mitigating against external delays. So the problem I typically see is that customers are being forced through a rigid and one-size-fits-all onboarding process that does not take into account their current levels of maturity, their resource availability, the readiness of their processes and their data, and the customer's priorities. And so this is where you really have an opportunity to differentiate your process by investing into content that asks customers to pick the items they'd like to focus on first based on their readiness and priorities. So you can imagine during the sales process or during the handoff or during the kickoff process, that'd be very easy to create a slide that asks customers to pick the problem areas that they would like to focus on first rather than doing everything all at once. And assuming you have a strong sales to handoff process, you might even be able to prescribe which areas they should focus on based on what you saw by reviewing those sales conversations through using conversational intelligence tools like Gong. You can look and see, oh, the customer clearly said that this is an area that's very important to them. Let's just demonstrate that we were listening through that process and prescribe to them that they should focus on these things first and that we're ready to go on those areas. Based on what they say, you then reorganize your standard onboarding project timeline to match the customer's priorities so that it's no longer one size fits all. It's really tailored to what they want to focus on and what they're ready to focus on. Another common blocker to decision-making for customers is that they often lack the data, either from their other systems or teams, to make a design decision on your software, and they're nervous to make the wrong decision. In this case, rather than waiting for them to have that data ready, because that's going to take some time, it's best to use sample or dummy data that you've created internally to guide them to make those decisions. This will also speed up conversations and break down false dependencies that the data has to be ready before we can have that conversation. The other benefit is that by having those conversations earlier, you're also adding value to customers by educating them on what good data looks like so that they hit the mark when it's time to integrate or upload the data. So having those sample data can really help them to do the right work internally and make sure that they're not going to miss your expectations. Lastly, I recommend tailoring the onboarding process itself to the customer's level of maturity by simplifying the initial solution that you recommend or that you focus on. This is where you can really help the customer and the amount of change management that's involved. So as you can imagine, implementing a new system is typically a pretty heavy change management item generally. So how can we further reduce the already high amount of change? What we can do is we can, rather than doing the gold star version of the solution, you can really start with a more simple solution and then focus on making it more advanced later on. So an example here is you might have options in your product for a simple, quote unquote, low maturity versus advanced workflows. So rather than having multi-stage approvals, you have a simple, the end user approves the workflow. So when you're looking at what level of solution you're prescribing, I recommend doing the one that matches their current maturity levels, because you're going to see the most speed when you go with that route. And like I said, you can always upgrade their solution later once the users are past that initial change management hurdle. Moving on, we have project financials. So the problem that we typically see in managing project financials and budgets is that there's a lack of rigor and governance around project status tracking and reporting. We don't consistently and proactively inform customers of issues that are causing delays, and the impact of those lack of decisions or lack of providing the data will have on timelines and budgets until it's already become a problem. And so the solution here is to level up your process and instill some discipline and visibility by having a weekly project status communication. This can go out over email and sent to the key customer stakeholders. And this can be a slide, it can be content in the body of the email. And what you want to include here is what's going well with the onboarding, where are there blockers, and if those blockers are not resolved, when it will impact the project timelines and budgets so that the customer has an opportunity to course correct ahead of time. Especially with enterprise projects, this is helpful because sometimes the senior folks don't understand that competing priorities on the working team is causing delays to the implementation. So you don't want to have any surprises when you've already created the delay. So having those stakeholders on the emails, flagging those risks to them proactively can help them to make sure that they're allocating their resources on their side appropriately. Sometimes we find that customers are going to end up going outside of the scope of the initial agreement. And so you might decide that that's fine, in which case you can use these communications to let them know that that's fine and that there won't be any additional fees for doing that. However, you might use this as an opportunity to proactively propose increasing the customer's professional services to achieve any of those new requirements that are outside of the scope. And you can offer additional packages of hours or service credits. So sending this on a regular basis and building a habit can really increase the amount of discipline and visibility that you're providing to customers to really make sure that they're staying on track with the project and they understand the impact of not staying on track. And that is some solutions to solving for external delays. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about internal delays. So here we'll focus on onboarding infrastructure and role optimization. So for onboarding infrastructure, a common definition of the problem is we lack the rigor and governance around managing the customer journey. So think of the customer journey as the phases of your customer experience. So this could be the handoff from sales to CS, your kickoff phase, your onboarding phase, your adoption phase, and we're not centrally tracking or reporting on that in order to drive, again, rigor and governance. We don't have a mechanism for controlling that a customer is meeting the gates. So think of gates as verifiable outcomes that must be achieved in order for the customer to progress to the next phase of the customer journey. And this includes gates for successful sales to customer success handoffs, for considering the onboarding phase as complete. So we want to centrally manage, do we have sign off on key decisions and meetings being successfully completed before we consider this customer onboarded? And so rather than assuming that the onboarding has been complete, we're going to make sure that we track and report on that centrally. We also lack a way of intaking and prioritizing and analyzing the requests that are coming from customers during onboarding. So this can be things that we're helping them with for SSO, integrations, configurations. All of these requests are flying around all over the place, and we need to ensure that nothing falls through the cracks. We don't have a way of understanding our execution bottlenecks, see what our most common types of requests are, and understand product gaps. So by lacking this way of managing all of the customer requests, we lack the data to be able to improve our processes and our product. Lastly, we lack the tools and processes for collaborating with customers and internally to manage these processes. So a tooling challenge in order to operationalize these processes. So from the solution side, we have a couple of things that we can do here to really move the needle. We can instill discipline and visibility by having a centralized journey management process in a customer success planning tool. So an example of a customer success planning tool is Planhat, and here's a board in Planhat where we can see all the customers that are in various stages of the customer journey. And before we move customers to subsequent stages, we're going to manage a workflow inside of the tool that we check off that things are being completed in order to move to the next phase. And we're going to challenge ourselves to really make sure that those things are being done well before we consider that phase complete. There's a link here to a methodology for managing this, both by using a customer success management tool and Pendo, which is a product analytics tool. So are we meeting certain product usage metrics before we move customers through to later phases of the customer journey? And I'll link that in the description of the video. The next challenge I see in the infrastructure is that customer requests are being managed in emails, Slack, and verbally on calls, and there's no central repository. Here, I recommend centralizing all requests from customers, wherever they come up from, email, Slack, verbally on calls, they all get logged into a Kanban tool. And this is a tool that you will be collaborating on directly with customers. So you might end up having a board per customer. Some tools allow you to aggregate across customers and some tools don't. It's really going to depend on how you want to manage the sophistication of the process. So by centralizing all of this information, once you get these basics down, you can get more advanced, and then you can start to look at those requests and analyze which ones have opportunities to create efficiencies, which ones are highlighting actually product gaps the customer can't do themselves. And from that analysis, you're really looking at product and process ideas for continuous improvement of your onboarding operations. Lastly, you can also leverage customer-facing portals, which are available in some customer success platforms. And you can use those portals not only for managing these requests, but you can use it for hosting education content, sharing files so that we always have the latest and the greatest version. And so that can be a tool that adds a lot of efficiency and rigor into your process. Next, we have role optimizations as a way internally of controlling for delays. So a common problem we see here is that our customer success team is unable to meet our expectations for the onboarding experience, and our expectations and the customer expectations are in line. So this is typically due to a combination of your role definitions for your onboarding your customer success team being too broad. If you're trying to get them to do too many things, a lack of time for them to then spend on developing the craft of customer onboarding, the craft of project management, the craft of consulting customers in the domain, the craft of developing the content required to make this a very slick process, and really to learn. So do they have time for training in that specific area? And often we also see that knowledge is being centralized in the heads of a few people, and it's not being managed in a common place. There's a lack of documentation around what to do. And so there's a bottleneck created by relying on too few of people. So the solution here is, as you start to see an increasing gap between your customer expectations of the onboarding experience versus the reality of what the team is actually providing, you should expect that gap will increase as you scale unless you invest in creating more specialized roles. So as you add more customers, if you're currently unable to meet those expectations, it's really a good time to consider investing in more specialized roles. Example here is if your customer success if your customer success managers are currently doing everything, you might want to look at creating a technical account management or solution engineering role so that customer success managers can really focus on account management and customer journey orchestration, and your technical account managers or solution engineers can really focus on technology consulting and execution. After you do that, you might find that your technical account managers and solution engineers are starting to, again, get stretched thin, and you're not able to meet the consulting or the technical execution experience that you want to. And this is where you can consider separating the technical account management role into two roles. So keep your technical account managers and solution engineers focused on developing their consulting craft, and introducing a technical implementation specialist role to focus on technical execution and the quality of that technical execution and the analysis of those requests and things like that, and working more closely with your product team. As you specialize, you'll also want to consider increasing your expectations for the quality of the experiences that each of those specialized roles are providing. Now that you've invested in specialization, you can also increase your expectations for the quality of the experiences because folks will have more bandwidth to really hone that craft. And that is two ways in which you can focus on the delays externally. So with that, I hope that you see that there's really multiple ways in which you can deploy solutions to reduce your external and internal delays and drastically improve your customer onboarding process and decrease time to value from what was previously months in this scenario to a few weeks. So I hope you enjoyed and look forward to seeing any questions and comments that you post. Thank you so much.